James Crawford's hands were shaking when he struck the match. Not from the cold, though the March morning air in Iowa still carried winter's bite, but from the knowledge that if this didn't work, his family would lose everything. The wood chunks inside the metal cylinder needed to catch just right, burn hot enough but not too hot, produce gas clean enough to run his tractor's engine without destroying it. He'd spent $17 on these oak chunks, money he couldn't afford to waste. His 80 acres of corn ground sat waiting, and every farmer in Johnson County knew the old saying, corn planted after April 15th might as well not be planted at all. The match caught. Small flames licked up through the kindling at the bottom of the firebox. James closed the heavy metal door and turned the air valve to the first setting, exactly like the manual said. Now came the waiting. 15 minutes minimum before the gasification unit would produce anything useful. 15 minutes watching smoke curl from the cooling pipes, while his neighbor's diesel tractor rumbled past on the road, already headed to the fields. That neighbor, Ed Hutchins, had laughed when James bought the wood gas generator 3 weeks ago, called it a fool's contraption, said he'd rather go back to horses than trust his spring planting to burning firewood. But Ed had diesel fuel stamps from his service station brother-in-law. James had 5 gallons of gasoline left in the world, and his next ration stamps wouldn't come for 11 more days. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Figure out how to make this work, or watch his corn season die before it started. The attack on Pearl Harbor 16 months ago had changed everything about farming, but nothing hit harder than the fuel rationing that started in May of 1942. James had bought his Farmall F-20 tractor in 1938, the same year his son Thomas was born. Paid it off in 3 years of good crops. That tractor represented everything modern farming promised. More acres worked with less labor, straight rows planted faster, cultivation done in a third the time it took with horses. His father had farmed with mules for 40 years. James had sworn his son would never have to. Now he stood in his farmyard at 5:30 in the morning, watching a metal cylinder full of burning wood and praying it would produce enough gas to run that same tractor. The irony tasted bitter as the wood smoke drifting past his face. The temperature gauge on the gasifier crept upward. 100 degrees, 150, 200. At 300 degrees, the manual said, the pyrolysis process would begin in earnest. The wood wouldn't just burn, it would transform. Limited oxygen would force a chemical change that released carbon monoxide and hydrogen, gases that could power an internal combustion engine if you cleaned them properly, cooled them enough and mixed them with air in exactly the right proportions. James understood maybe half of what the manual tried to explain, but he understood desperation perfectly, and desperation was a powerful teacher. At 18 minutes, with the gauge reading 340 degrees, James opened the test valve. Gas hissed out and he held a match to it like the demonstration had shown. The gas caught with a steady blue flame. Not the yellow, sooty flame that meant too much tar. Not the weak, sputtering flame that meant the wood was too wet. A clean, hot blue flame that meant the system was working. His hands stopped shaking. He closed the test valve, opened the feed valve to the carburetor, and climbed onto the Farmall. The starting procedure was different now. Engage the gasifier throttle first, let the gas flow build, then hit the electric start. The engine cranked once, twice, caught with a cough and a cloud of exhaust that smelled nothing like gasoline, then settled into a rough idle. It sounded wrong, felt wrong, but it was running. James sat on that tractor seat and let himself breathe for the first time that morning. Then he noticed his wife Martha standing on the porch, their son on her hip. She wasn't smiling, but she nodded once. That nod meant more than any words could. It meant they were still in the fight. The first day of plowing taught James everything the manual hadn't. The power loss was worse than advertised. Where he used to plow in third gear at 4 miles per hour, now second gear at 2 miles per hour, was all the tractor could manage. The engine lugged under load, threatening to stall if he pushed too hard. Every 2 hours, he had to stop and add more wood chunks to the gasifier, a process that took 10 minutes if he moved fast and didn't burn himself on the hot metal. Every 4 hours, he had to clean the primary filter, scraping out the tar and ash that accumulated despite the cooling system's best efforts. What used to take 3 days took 6. His back ached from the constant turning to check the gasifier's temperature, from climbing on and off the tractor to refuel it. from the tension of listening for any change in engine note that might mean trouble. But at the end of that 6th day, his corn ground was ploughed. Ed Hutchins, who'd laughed at the wood burner, had only finished half his acreage. His diesel stamps had run out, and his brother-in-law suddenly wasn't returning phone calls. By mid-April, 6 more farmers in the township had bought or built wood gasification units. James became an unlikely expert, the man other farmers came to when their systems wouldn't start or ran rough, or produced gas that smelled wrong. He learned that white oak was better than red, that ash wood burned cleaner than hickory, that wood split the previous fall and stored under cover worked better than anything cut fresh. He learned that the secret wasn't following the manual exactly, but understanding what the system was trying to do and helping it do that. The learning came with costs. In late April, he pushed the engine too hard, pulling a disc through heavy ground, didn't notice the temperature gauge climbing into the red zone. Something in the gasifier's internal baffling warped from the heat. The system worked, but never quite as well after that. Never produced quite as clean a gas. He spent $8 on replacement parts he couldn't afford, and a full day tearing the unit apart to install them. In early May, he ran the fuel bed too low, and the fire went out completely in the middle of cultivating. Restarting took an hour. The corn rows he'd been working began to bake in the afternoon sun, and he watched helplessly as weeds he should have been killing grew stronger, while he fed kindling into a cold firebox and waited for the gasifier to come back to temperature. That night, Martha found him sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him until he was ready to go back inside. But there were victories too. In June, when his corn was knee-high and growing strong, the county extension agent brought 3 farmers from over in Cedar County to see his operation. James showed them how he'd modified the air intake to give better control, how he'd added an extra layer of filtration using steel wool that he cleaned and reused, how he kept a logbook recording wood consumption and engine performance so he could spot problems before they became serious. One of the visiting farmers, an older man who'd farmed through the Depression, shook James's hand and said, "Son, you're doing what farmers have always done. You're making do." That's nothing to be ashamed of. The community that formed around wood gas operation that summer had a quality James had never experienced before. It wasn't like the old barn-raising traditions his grandfather talked about, because this wasn't about helping one neighbor in need. Everyone needed help. Everyone was learning. The county extension office started holding meetings every 2 weeks, where farmers would gather to trade information. Sarah McKinley, whose husband was serving in the Pacific, brought detailed drawings showing how she'd improved the filtration system on her tractor. Tom Reeves had discovered that shaking the fuel bed every 30 minutes instead of every hour reduced tar buildup significantly. Dutch Zimmerman brought samples of 6 different wood species, each burned under identical conditions, with notes about gas quality and ash production. The women, largely excluded from the traditional male domain of tractor operation, found themselves essential to the wood gas effort. They couldn't serve overseas, couldn't work in the factories that were taking so many men, but they could keep their farms running. Martha Crawford learned to operate the gasifier as well as James did, maybe better. She had patience for the finicky starts and the constant attention the system demanded. On days when James was working far fields, she'd bring him fresh wood chunks in the truck, already sized and ready so he wouldn't lose time. She kept the logbook more faithfully than he did, noting not just fuel consumption but weather conditions, soil moisture, anything that might affect performance. Then came the morning in late July that nearly ended everything. James was cultivating the back 40, the section farthest from the house, when he smelled something wrong. Not the usual wood smoke smell, but something sharper, more chemical. He glanced back at the gasifier and saw flames licking out around the firebox door seal. Not the controlled burn that was supposed to stay contained inside the unit, but actual fire escaping into open air, inches from the tractor's fuel line that still held 2 gallons of precious gasoline. His mind went blank with panic for exactly 3 seconds. Then training took over. He killed the engine immediately, cutting off the gas flow and the air intake. Grabbed the old wool blanket he kept tucked under the seat for exactly this kind of emergency and threw it over the gasifier, smothering the external flames. His hands were shaking again, Worse than that first morning back in March, the fire went out. The gasifier ticked and popped as it cooled. James sat on the ground next to his tractor, breathing hard, calculating how close he'd come to disaster. If those flames had reached the fuel line, the explosion would have destroyed the tractor and probably killed him. The tractor represented 4 years of payments, 3 years of profit, the difference between his family keeping the farm and losing it. His life insurance policy would have paid off the mortgage, but Martha and Thomas would have been left with nothing else. No way forward, no options. He found the problem after an hour of inspection. A crack in the firebox weld, probably from thermal stress when he'd overheated the system back in April. The crack had slowly grown over 3 months of operation until it finally opened wide enough to let flames escape. If he'd been working closer to the house, if Martha had been nearby, she might have seen it sooner. But he'd been alone, far from help, and he'd come within seconds of catastrophic failure. The repair took 3 days and cost $22 he didn't have. He borrowed the money from the bank against his fall crop, adding to debt that already kept him awake at night. But the alternative was going back to horses, spending money he also didn't have on animals and equipment he'd sold off years ago. The wood gas system, dangerous and difficult as it was, remained his only viable option. That near disaster changed how he operated. He inspected every weld, every seal, every connection before starting each day. He carried a fire extinguisher, borrowed from the town volunteer fire department, strapped to the tractor where he could reach it in seconds. He never worked alone in far fields anymore. Martha or young Thomas would come out periodically to check on him, a safety measure that ate into everyone's time, but seemed essential after what had almost happened. The other farmers heard about the fire. Instead of mocking him or using it as evidence that wood gas was too dangerous, they came by to see the repair, to learn what to watch for on their own systems, to share their own close calls. Tom Reeves had nearly been burned by superheated gas venting from a faulty cooling pipe. Dutch Zimmerman's filtration system had caught fire from accumulated tar, though he'd caught it before any real damage occurred. Everyone was learning, everyone was adapting, and everyone understood that the alternative to accepting the risks was giving up entirely. By harvest time in October of 1943, James Crawford had successfully farmed his 80 acres on wood gas and the 5 gallons of hoarded gasoline he'd saved for running the combine. His yields were down about 5% from the previous year, but they were down because he'd worked slower and more carefully, not because the system had failed. He'd burned roughly 6 cords of oak through the growing season. Wood he'd cut the previous winter from his own timber lot. The math worked out to about $3 per cord for his labor, $18 total versus the $90 to $100 that gasoline would have cost at pre-war prices. But the real calculation wasn't in dollars. It was in what he'd learned about himself, about his neighbors, about what was possible when there seemed to be no options left. He'd taken a technology that seemed impossible, made it work through sheer determination and community knowledge sharing, and proven that American farmers could adapt to circumstances that would have seemed unthinkable just 2 years earlier. The spring of 1944 came with new confidence. James had his farm all running on the gasifier by late March, and this time the startup was routine. He knew the sounds, knew the smells, knew when to add wood and when to clean filters. The near disaster from the previous July had taught him respect for the system's dangers, but it hadn't broken his determination. The tractor still produced only about 60% of its gasoline power, still required constant attention, still made farming harder than it had been in 1941. But it ran. It worked. It got the crops in the ground. Ed Hutchins, who'd laughed at the wood burner 2 years earlier, showed up in April with a brand new gasification unit mounted on his diesel tractor. Turned out you could adapt the system to run on diesel with the gas as a supplemental fuel, stretching precious diesel rations much further. Ed didn't apologize for the laughter, but he did ask James to help him with the initial setup and tuning. James spent an afternoon teaching Ed everything he'd learned, and Ed paid him back by helping replant a section of field where the seed corn had failed. By the summer of 1944, wood gas operation in Johnson County, Iowa, was so common that seeing a tractor without a gasifier unit looked strange. The county had become something of a model, and agricultural officials from Washington came through on a tour, taking notes and photographs, interviewing farmers about their experiences. James spent an hour talking to a young agriculture department researcher who wrote down everything he said with intense concentration. The researcher asked if James was proud of what he'd accomplished. James thought about that question for a long moment before answering. Proud wasn't quite the right word. He was grateful. Grateful that when everything seemed impossible, when the modern world he'd trusted had let him down, he'd found a way forward. Grateful that after the fire nearly destroyed everything, he'd had the knowledge and the support to rebuild and keep going. Grateful that his family hadn't lost the farm, that the community had pulled together instead of falling apart, that Martha and Thomas had a future because he'd refused to quit when quitting seemed like the only rational choice. The war ended in August of 1945. James heard the news on the radio while eating lunch in the kitchen, Martha beside him, Thomas playing with toy tractors on the floor. Victory over Japan meant the boys would come home, meant gasoline would flow freely again. By October, the gasifier came off the farm for the last time. The tractor ran smooth and powerful on straight gasoline. Fan James remembered why he'd bought the machine in the first place. He stored the gasifier unit in the machine shed, cleaned and covered, instead of scrapping it like most farmers did. Martha asked him why. Insurance, he said, though that wasn't quite the whole answer. It was a reminder too. A reminder that when modern convenience failed, when the easy path disappeared, American farmers had found a harder way and made it work. A reminder that his generation had faced an impossible situation and refused to accept defeat. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable thing you can teach your children isn't how to use the best tools, but how to survive when those tools are taken away. The wood gas era faded quickly from American agriculture. By 1947, most evidence had disappeared. Tractors ran on gasoline and diesel. The detailed logs gathered dust. The community meetings stopped. But for farmers like James Crawford, who had lived through it, who had made burning wood power internal combustion engines designed for petroleum, who had nearly died from their own determination to keep farming no matter what, the experience remained absolutely clear. They had done something remarkable. They had adapted when adaptation seemed impossible. They had survived. That's what American farmers have always done. That's what they'll always do. Find a way, no matter what it takes. Even if it means burning wood to power machines built for gasoline. Even if it means learning complex new skills under pressure. Even if it means risking everything because the alternative is losing everything anyway. The wood gas generators are gone now, mostly forgotten. But the spirit that made them work, that's still here. That never goes away. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of the most remarkable and forgotten chapters in American farming history. If you enjoyed learning about the incredible resourcefulness of wartime farmers, please subscribe to our channel for more stories about the ingenuity, determination, and community spirit that built American agriculture. Hit that like button if this story inspired you, and share it with anyone who appreciates the creative problem solving that has always defined rural America. Your support helps us continue uncovering these hidden pieces of farming history that deserve to be remembered. This video is inspired by real historical events and the documented experiences of American farmers during World War II fuel rationing. James Crawford is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who successfully adopted wood gasification technology to continue agricultural production during wartime fuel shortages. This content is not intended to represent or offend any individual or group, but rather to honor the resilience and innovation of an entire generation of farmers who refused to let impossible circumstances stop them from feeding their families and their nation.